All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Weather Where You Are this morning. Lots to cover in the tropics as we have a monster storm that just made landfall along part of the Windward Islands at 11 a.m. So that is something we will update you on. Of course, we're talking about Major Hurricane Beryl, a historic storm within itself, as it became the first, rather, major Category 4 storm to form in the Atlantic in the month of June ever on record. So that is just a testament to the hurricane season ahead. The fact that we were able to generate a major Category 4 hurricane in the Atlantic this early in the season speaks volumes about how warm the water is and how prime the conditions are for more storms that will start to come off the coast of Africa, usually, to develop into hurricanes. So let's talk about what's going on right now and talk about where the storm is headed because, of course, this is a really busy travel week. A lot of you have the week off or at least a long weekend. And if you had travel plans to the Caribbean or Mexico, you definitely are going to want to listen up because this storm is going to have an impact in some way as this storm continues to move west. So right now, this is the latest information from the National Hurricane Center. Beryl now just shy of Category 5 hurricane status, just shy, with winds of 150 miles per hour. Essentially, as the storm made landfall along one of the Windward Islands just south of St. Lucia at 11 a.m., when the storm moved inland, sometimes what happens is when storms impact land and make landfall perpendicular to the island, essentially kind of a direct hit, sometimes that can compress the eye of hurricanes. And think about when a figure skater pulls her arms in really tight, it makes her spin faster. Well, essentially when you compress that eye wall, sometimes that can make the winds higher. So essentially, hurricane recon officers went and dropped one of the radiosondes down in there and said, okay, the winds are 150 miles per hour. So can't, of course, confirm if eye wall compression is what created this uptick in wind speed, but it's definitely possible. And the storm was already very close, a very strong Cat 4 as of 8 o'clock this morning. So continuing to strengthen. Now it's making landfall. It will start to weaken briefly after it moves away from the Windward Islands. When it interacts with land, that kind of shakes up storms. So it will briefly weaken as it makes its way into the Caribbean and on its way closer to Jamaica in the coming days. But right now, unfortunately, catastrophic wind, storm surge, wave heights. If you know these islands, if you've ever visited these islands, you know that they're very small. They're very difficult to get to. A lot of times you have to take very small planes or you have to take boats to get out there. So I'm sure some of the images that we're going to see out of there, unfortunately, are going to be quite devastating. The size of those islands versus a almost Cat 5 hurricane, not going to be a good deal out there. So something that we'll bring to you as we get that information and as we get those images, which I'm sure we will. Let's take you through the rest of the week. So as we head into tomorrow morning, Beryl is forecast to maintain that Category 4 status as we head into tomorrow morning. The winds will die down just a touch. And then as it makes its way through the Caribbean Straits closer to Jamaica, it'll run into a little more wind shear. And wind shear kind of tears apart hurricanes. So that will allow it to go down to a Category 2 hurricane. Still a very powerful hurricane with winds of 110 miles per hour as it goes south of Jamaica. Now, it could make a direct hit on the southern coast of Jamaica. Nonetheless, Jamaica will receive impacts. In fact, a hurricane watch already in effect for the entire island of Jamaica. Which essentially means that hurricane conditions are likely because this is going to get so close that the hurricane conditions will spread out to the island of Jamaica as we head into Wednesday morning. So again, if you had travel plans there midweek, you're going to want to be keeping a really close eye on your flights or any way of transportation that you were getting down there because this storm will have an impact midweek on that island. So as we make our way into late week, Thursday, Friday, this storm then weakens to a Category 1 as it approaches the Yucatan Peninsula. So we're talking areas like Cancun, Tulum, Cozumel, Belize. This storm is going to head right that direction. And notice the cone can shift as far north as Cancun, can go as far south as around Belize. So there's still at least a little uncertainty in the track once the storm makes its way past Jamaica. But nonetheless, direct impact likely along the Yucatan Peninsula. This storm is fairly large. We've seen bigger hurricanes, but the good thing about this storm is that the eye is so small that the wind field around it isn't large. So Again, when this storm goes south of Jamaica, it's not likely that Category 2 hurricane force winds are going to spread out to the island unless, of course, that track shifts a little further north and it kind of skirts right along the coast of Jamaica. But that is the only kind of good thing, is that the entire stretch of the Windward Islands aren't going to be receiving catastrophic wind damage because that it seems like the wind field on this storm is fairly small. Nonetheless, again, if you have travel plans to Mexico later this week, maybe you're taking a cruise, just know that you're probably going to get detoured around that late week because the storm is going to make landfall more likely than not along the Yucatan Peninsula. I don't see that changing. So hurricane conditions likely for parts of Mexico as we head into the end of the week before it moves back into the southern Gulf by the weekend. Speaking of, though, the southern Gulf has been a really hot spot when it comes to all of our disturbances. Really, a lot of the disturbances we've been watching have been developing in the southwest Gulf. We actually had Tropical Storm Chris develop overnight, and then it turned into a depression. Now it's just a remnant low because it's falling apart as it moved inland. Very briefly made it to that tropical storm status before it made landfall. So we did have Chris kind of sneak up on us overnight, but just bringing a lot of heavy rain to places like Tampico and along the eastern coast of Mexico there. And they're going to get more rain as Beryl moves closer. It could very well bring more rain to that same area. So that's a concern within itself. Obviously, these tropical systems bring very heavy rainfall. So that area going to get a lot of rain in a very short period of time, something that is concerning within itself, hurricane or not, even though it didn't have a hurricane move through, that being Chris. And it more than likely will have, as Beryl moves by, it won't be a hurricane any longer, but the tropical downpours are still a threat within itself, whether it's associated with a hurricane, tropical storm, tropical depression. Now, we do have another wave that is pushing off the coast of Africa. It has weakened, so that's a sign that there's a little bit more wind shear developing in the Atlantic, maybe some Saharan dust. That dust kind of chokes these systems. It doesn't allow them to thrive and grow and become strong and organized. So thankfully, this next little disturbance that's coming off the coast of Africa, now down to a 60% chance of development, but still something worth keeping an eye on. Notice the same track as Beryl pretty much. And then looking off the coast of Africa, another wave potentially developing. Now, in July, usually where Beryl formed, kind of right to the east of the Windward Islands, that starts to be a little more typical this time of year. So not necessarily completely out of the norm to have a storm develop where it did. Because now the waters are starting to warm up a little more, but you usually don't get extremely strong major hurricanes until mid to late season. And then having a bunch of storms develop in the middle of the Atlantic, usually don't get that for the next month or so either, because the Atlantic just isn't simply warm enough, and you usually do have a lot of Saharan dust out there. So this isn't necessarily super out of the ordinary, but definitely something that as a meteorologist you kind of pay close attention to, because it's a sign that the hyperactive season is only just beginning, and it's more than likely going to pan out the way that the National Hurricane Center forecasted it to. So all this tropical activity, we talked about this last week. It's all developing It's all developing along a Bermuda high. It's a semi-permanent high pressure system that hangs out in the Atlantic this time of year, and it ultimately helps steer these tropical systems. So the way wind rotates around an area of high pressure is clockwise, so everything's kind of getting carried around that high, and how strong that high remains will help determine any future storms that do develop off the coast of Africa, that do develop over in the Windward Islands in the Caribbean, because this will help steer it. Now, as that high starts to weaken and starts to retreat, which is typical as you head into the later season, closer into the cooler months. Now, of course, here in Georgia, cooler doesn't usually come until like October, November. But nonetheless, when the season starts shifting, because hurricane season does run all the way through November, we will have that high start to weaken and retreat a little bit, which is usually when you start to see those landfalls more so along our Gulf Coast, over in Florida. So we're going to keep an eye on this high, because as soon as it starts to weaken, any more storms that develop, that can help steer it a little closer to home here rather than sending them all out to Mexico. So just something that we'll be keeping a really close eye on, but that has been our saving grace here in the lower 48 states when it comes to all of these systems that have tried to develop, and some that actually have developed into named storms. Sea surface temperature is also key, and boy, are they hot. It is a bathtub out in the Gulf, Caribbean, and the Atlantic. So prime temperature for hurricane development around 84 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're seeing in the Caribbean, where again, notice Beryl's going to go over the Windward Islands. It'll interact with land, and it won't weaken all that much as it moves into the Caribbean because the water is extremely warm, 86 degrees through the Caribbean Straits, and it stays in the low to mid 80s all the way towards the Yucatan Peninsula. So this is a huge factor in why this storm develops so quickly, going from a tropical depression to a hurricane within, I believe, 48 hours, if not less than that, and then ultimately a major hurricane in less than 72 hours. So rapid intensification for a slew of reasons. One, of course, the warm water, which is fuel for these storms, but also the lack of wind shear, that change in wind direction and speed with height. And essentially for hurricanes to strengthen in a big way, they need to be vertically stacked. Their centers need to be vertically stacked. So wind shear prevents that, and that usually helps weaken them or prevent them from strengthening into something like a major Category 4 hurricane. So all the ingredients came together for Beryl to really be a monster storm, and we'll continue to watch the tropics as it is clear that the atmosphere is prime for development right now. So far, 3 named storms, 1 hurricane, that being Beryl, but then that ultimately turned into a major hurricane, so we can check one of those off the list. The National Hurricane Center forecasting 4 to 7 this season, and 8 to 13 hurricanes, 17 to 25 named storms. So just hang on tight, everyone. We are in for it. Hurricane season just started not too long ago, and we have a couple more months left, several more months left, and we'll be keeping a very close eye on it. So we've so far had Alberto, we've had Beryl, we've had Chris. Next on the list is Debbie. So the next named storm will make it to the letter D. That will be Debbie, and beyond that, Ernesto. So we'll continue to keep an eye on the tropics for you as we continue to get more information. Of course, you can learn more about Beryl and its track. We have a story dedicated to that on the First Alert weather app and at AtlantaNewsFirst.com. So if you have travel plans that this storm might be a concern to, just be sure that you're checking that story, because we'll continue to update you on the forecast and where it's headed, timing, all that good stuff, so you can be as informed as possible on Beryl, as we know that a lot of you will probably be traveling this week. So, all right, everyone, thanks for joining me for Weather Where You Are. We'll catch you here tomorrow at 11:30. In the meantime, make it a wonderful day.